Let's get into the book. I know you like that. You could record that. That could be your ringtone if you like. Let's get into the book. No, for real. Let's talk about it. This is like one of my favorite books we've read for book club, Ron.
Really?
Yes. Granted, I'm not like at every book club, but I've been to, a fair share. And this is one of my favorites. How are y'all feeling? We could break it up into stories if you like, or you could just start talking about parts you like. Y'all know what to do. How are we feeling? As you ponder that, I'm going to, Stephanie, don't be mad, but I was talking to Stephanie about the book, and I'm going to put her on blast for something she said because it was really insightful, and I wonder if she could share it. When we were talking about it, she was like, we were both like, oh my God, I love the way it's written. It's so nice, blah, blah, blah. And Stephanie had said, oh, I wonder what it would be like to read it in Brazilian. And Stephanie, can you share with us like what that sentiment came from and sort of why?
Yeah, so it's a translated, copy. So it says translated by Julia Sanchez. I don't know what version y'all have or if y'all doing the audio book, but it's originally written in Portuguese, and I'm always interested in like what gets lost in translation or if it sounds better in another language, because English isn't necessarily, in my opinion, the most beautiful language. And so like I think that like some of the things that just some of the writing, I guess I'll point to a page that I wonder like, wow, how did this sound in Portuguese? The story that I guess sticks out, I guess it would be Eduarda Do Not Pass Out.
That's my favorite story, y'all. Okay.
And so the way that I did the first sentence is just, it's one of those things that happens, you fall. No, you splat on the ground. Like I wonder, like even splat, like just how that was said, I wonder like how it sounded in Portuguese, just because it's such a pleasure to read it. Like as I'm reading it, I'm like, wow, this is like, I'm really hooked in how she writes. Even the dialogue, like it's sometimes a dialogue is read like on page 12 between her and her mother. It's just sentences back to back to back to back to back, almost like the conversation. It doesn't necessarily read like as a, like if you're reading a play and it says a character, like Stephanie says this, Paula says that, Ron. It was just kind of like a back and forth that gave me like the feeling of like urgency between the both of them, between her mom and Eduarda. Yeah. And even like the all caps part, like I wonder like what would have been like the expressions in all caps. I don't know. So those are just things that were coming to mind as I've been reading this.
Stephanie, as the famous
Thanks
philosopher,
for bringing it up, Paula.
As the famous philosopher Young Miami would say, period.
Period.
Okay? No, that was excellent. That's definitely true.
You know what I mean?
Naming what does onomatopoeia sound like in Portuguese?
Right.
Like really dope.
Yeah. I mean, when you hear the Brazilians talk, they're very macho. Their language is, when you hear it, it's very strong and it's very, I hate to use the word macho, but it is. And it's in their language, and it's how they walk through their cities. There's a certain kind of, it's just a lot of power. I think it's interesting that you want to hear that. I think I was kind of struck by, I kept thinking Eduarda was Edward. So for the longest time, I'm like, why does she have a man's name? Like there was this kind of dissonance for me. And not in a negative way. I was like, is Eduarda female for Edward or Edwina? I couldn't pull it together.
I think that's true. That's true, because the language, it can be very gendered too, right? Like in Spanish, I know that's a fact, and also in Portuguese. That sometimes you don't necessarily experience that in English with the words, but yeah, I can see that.
My best friend is Dominican, and she's always telling me sayings and stuff in Spanish, and then she'll have to translate it, and then she'll be like, "It sounds so much better in Spanish," and I'm like, "Damn." She's like, "No, it's just it's so poetic, and it's just, or it's more romantic, or it's just more passionate, and I'm just like, damn, I don't know. Like I really need to learn Spanish. But I have a question though. I have the audiobook, so I don't, it says pages 1 to 57, but I don't know
Yeah.
the chapters. So
I
I
think
don't
that was 1 through 4,
1 through 4. Okay. So
I
yeah,
think.
I was
I have the audiobook also,
and I don't know if
1 through 5.
1
1
through
through
5.
5.
Okay, thank you. And I didn't, I don't know what part, since I didn't know until now, like we were supposed to get up to, but I don't, what is, while we're on the topic of language, what's the word, a much something, when she was calling slow? I didn't get up,
Machora.
yeah, I didn't get up to, did we get up to the part where that came out? Okay, because I didn't get to that part. So I'm still, I had to log in because I was still listening, and I'm like, oh crap, it's after 7. Let me just stop it now. But what what is that?
I don't have to answer. Anyone could feel free to answer. What's a machora? We know.
I think a lesbian, no?
A dyke. A
Oh,
machora is a
Machora,
dyke.
yeah, the translation is the term dyke, like not
Mhm.
lesbian. It's not. It's supposed to come off a little more aggressive, maybe even more
Oh.
insulting, depending on who it comes from. It's definitely not meant as a term of endearment.
Right.
Okay.
And I said
But-
that not because I knew it in Portuguese. I said it because of the context of how they were using that word. And it's like,
It's derogatory.
you know, it's a derogatory word. Yeah.
But why didn't they want to explain it? I mean, if you're going to use a word in your house, and then they were trying to dance around explaining the meaning of the word. I understand you curse. Sometimes, you curse around kids and you don't want the kids to repeat it.
Right.
But if it didn't feel, I don't know, it didn't feel genuine that they would try so hard to avoid explaining what that word meant.
that's
Well,
so
part of
funny.
Just say it.
Yes, and I see that, but also when we understand, and we're gonna, Stephanie, you started us well in grounding us, and that this book was written in a different language, right? So we always have to remember that every time we're in these conversations, and even in where our characters are in different parts of the story. And if you speak another language, I can only speak towards Spanish, right? Like I don't know Portuguese, and I know that in Spanish, with language being gendered and homophobic, the goal is to not explain, right? Like that is the whole point. That is the erasure of queer people in that naming in our language, that in Spanish, the whole point is not to say what it is. You're going to choose like the most outrageous word possible in order to make it very clear that that's what that is. And that's why we also understand, particularly I can name in my family community, queer folks who grow up in the language who don't even understand that like they're queer, and associating that terminology and that word to sort of like how they understand their sexuality. And that happens often in Spanish language. And I can assume it's intentional perhaps on Natalia's part to sort of name the, really to bring us to the kitchen, right? To have us be as comfortable as we are in our family's home, and still be separated by that terminology and by the, I think as Anais mentioned, like the derogatory nature of it. Like I should not have to explain it because that's what that is, you know? Anyone wanna, what y'all think about what I said?
Well, I think it's also, it really brought back to
8.
me.
Yeah.
Oh, I'm sorry. Did somebody else?
No, I was gonna say she was also 8 years old, I think, right? She was a little girl.
Yep.
Right.
She's
So
a little girl, but she is asking these questions though. She wants.
that's what we do to kids, though. We try to be like, it's okay, it means this, like,
And it makes us want to investigate more. That brought, when I was reading that part, it brought back a memory of me listening to Aaliyah rock the boat and work the middle. And my sister was like, why are you singing that song? You know what that means? And I was like, no, what does it mean? And she didn't tell me. So I investigated, I asked people, I went to school, that stayed on me until I figured out what it meant. And it took me all but one day. And had you not have brought that up, I would have been singing the song, like, you know, just because I like the melody, I like, you know, and that's it. But the fact that you try to like hide it from me, and then it like she did too, she really was curious and she wanted to know, like, if that part was just, and so common, like I said. Like, I'm sure we all have an experience like that, or we've done it or seen it. It's just, I'm gonna be mindful of that. But yeah.
But I think a lot of times adults talk in front of children, and it's like the children are invisible, you know, until they ask that question. You know, and the parents don't know what to say because, you know, maybe they feel ashamed, or maybe they feel that the child is too young or whatever. But yeah, the stories that I read, it was good because it was coming out being gay, a gay woman, and different elements, you know, of their humanity, you know, of the first love, of being hurt, you know, and that's what we all face, you know, regardless of our gender preference, you know. So that's what I liked, you know.
I think first and foremost, the stories here are truly about girls and women trying to figure out what they feel about themselves. How do they feel about themselves? First and foremost, you have to get past yourself and your insecurities, and then the relationships that you're going to bring those feelings into.
Right, and naming that these are queer, you know, like we have to also name that it's not just the expectation, because when we understand those forms of identity, you can have those feelings, but then the media and the television and family around you may reinforce how you feel or tell you there's nobody like that. Those feelings you have, they don't, you know. So I think it's important to name that, yeah, this is not necessarily about like a certain kind of girl going through these feelings. Many people experience these first. But I think it's very starkly clear that like in a queer identity specifically, like we're naming, you know, it's not everybody. Yeah, like we all can relate, but this is really not about everybody. And I want to make sure we don't us and you know, it's that's why I love this book. I think it's brilliant. It causes us in our perspective and our own identities to sort of like not start from there. Usually the cis hetero start is the starting point. And I think coming into this book, you know, we can't necessarily move in that, and that's a beautiful thing. What do y'all feel about Grandma, Are You a Lesbian? That's my favorite one. I'm not gonna hold you. That's my favorite.
Yeah.
Grandma, Are You a Lesbian?
Can I say something before we move on to that one?
Oh,
the other one?
please.
Because this short story had a big impact on me, particularly when we're talking about the language and the use of the word machora. And it brought back a very like visceral memory I had a big impact on me in my coming out experience. So, you know, my mother's family was Puerto Rican. I grew up with my mother's family. And I remember the word maricón. And I remember, which is like machora, I mean, but for a man, you know, and it's faggot, you know, it's very derogatory and very homophobic. And I just remember growing up and the conversations that my aunts, my older cousins would have in which that word was used like in such a ordinary way. And, but it was so clear that it was like disgusting, really disgusting. And like I came out when I was 35, but I questioned my identity probably from the time I was like 18. And I remember when I finally decided to come out, not just come out, I mean, decided to kind of change my life and, you know, be with women. I didn't tell my family, that same family, I didn't tell them for 8 years. I told my closest cousin and everybody else, my other cousins, my aunts. I had that memory of that word, maricón, like in my body. And I just couldn't bear what it would feel like if I had that thrown at me in some way. So I had a big impact. It's very interesting when I did tell my family 8 years later. It was very interesting. My aunt, she was probably 85. Oh no, she was probably 70 then. She's 94 now, whatever. She said, "It's okay by me. It's okay by me." She just kept repeating, like, I wanted to tell her more about this woman I now was in a relationship with, and it's okay by me. It's okay by me. And then my cousin said, well, it's about time you told us. So it's like interesting, like me having to keep that in the closet with my family as I was going through that process. And it having so much to do with that experience growing up of the homophobia, like in my, close family. So anyway, I just wanted to share that.
Thank you, Anais.
I think the world is homophobic. It's not just like one culture or one nation.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you have people within, the different cultures who have a more enlightened, thinking process. And then there are some cultures where they do, but accept, or they integrate gay men, women into their culture, into their, like some Native Americans, some African, but it's very few, so which is interesting. Yeah.
I think that's a great point, naming also. When we look at culture, culture oftentimes can be conceived in a very patriarchal sense. And that patriarchy can lead to all types of things, sexism, homophobia, racism, right? And naming that, like, also, now I'm piggybacking off our last book, so I won't drag it too much. But the reimagining the new, right? And it's particularly if you're in Black and brown body, what is, there's also the understanding that like Black and brown culture is deeply queer and has been for forever, and the erasure of that queerness is sort of also what is more mainstream and what we all understand our Puerto Rican culture or our Black culture or our Southern culture or Dominican culture to be. And I'm sorry if I'm not naming other folks. But Blackness, brown body has always been queer. And what does it look like for us to also read these stories through that understanding too, and through that lens, in addition to what we know to be true, which is like the homophobia of our cultures, right? I think that can help enlighten some of these stories. You could respond to that, but I'm dead serious. I want to know how y'all feel about grandma. Are you a lesbian? Like, I really want to know about that. Naming something too, like someone in our book club just shared a concise, beautiful, but moment of like their coming out experience. And now we have in this story, an elder literally trying to talk to her legacy, her granddaughter, around queerness. And what does that look like? Anais, you held it down. Wow. And how do y'all feel about that? What kind of feelings did that spark for you? Were you nervous for the grandma? Were you nervous for her? Like, what came up in that?
Okay, can you hear me? Hello,
Yes,
hello.
Yeah,
Okay.
I hear you.
I've been trying to talk for the longest time. I love the grandma story. My queer experience is evolving. I'm in the midst of it, and it's weird for me because my mother was a lesbian, and then like she went to church and wasn't claiming it, and then she was, and she got married, and then she wasn't, and she was back at church. So it was always this back and forth thing that she did. So how the other woman had mentioned maricon, for me it was bull dagger. That was the terminology that the old people would use to refer to the women that my mother was around. Like, like the lady she was dating played softball. So my grandmother didn't want me to play softball. It was just, little things like that. But I love the grandmother story because we all have that couple in the family where both of them are uncles or both of them are aunties. Like for my mom, it was like my mom and Auntie Beverly. No one overtly said what it was, but you knew what it was and you honored it no matter what. So I kind of had like a little appreciation for that story. But all of these stories are so necessary because the truth that's laced within has the ability to give voice and power and confidence to others who are in the midst of their evolution and embracing and understand who they are and the life that they want to live. So it's always important to understand the discovery story because I was looking for stories just to get a better understanding and a connection. And the first story I read was The Price of Salt because I like literature. So I'm like, okay, I'm gonna go to The Price of Salt. And that little girl in that book irritated me so bad. She got on every last nerve that I had. And I'm like, oh my goodness, are you kidding me? But at the same time, her discomfort and the process she went, the struggle, embracing your ideas and yourself when everything around you is pushing this other thing on you and you want to be successful. So do you bend for success or do you stand for what it is that you believe in? And all of these journeys and all of these voices and all of these truths are so important.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And she's coming out of a culture. I don't know if I mean in these I'm still working on Grandma, Are You a Lesbian? But I was aware that my sense of place, I'm not sure that that I actually really see Brazil. Um in any acute way. But I was I'm gonna let it be. I'm gonna let it be.
But what would Brazil look like in this context?
I don't know. I was trying to think about where were they. I thought she might be in Rio, but I wasn't sure. And I'm not sure that place matters to these stories, is what I think I'm pointing at. I think it's really the evolution of character and whatever moment they find themselves in. I'm not sure that place matters to this particular writer. And I'm not sure where this writer is. Is she in the States? Is she in Brazil? Wasn't sure. And I'm not sure that it matters, but I don't think place matters in these stories as much as I would, as, as much as I was expecting it to.
And you know, as Stephanie pointed out, we are reading a translation. So I'm sure if we could read it in the original text, you might feel differently about it. You know, the Brazilian identity or Portuguese identity.
Right.
Definitely.
And you know, a lot of these things, I spent the summer listening to different translators of Elena Ferrante's novels. There were a lot of discussions on translation, and you know, some translators get it, and some translators get the nuances and are able to communicate that, and others kind of gloss over. I can't judge this, but it makes me wonder. What time do you think these stories are occurring in?
I think it's modern. I think it's contemporary, present.
Yeah, they feel contemporary to me.
As present.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess because we understand these stories to take place in Brazil, maybe we're looking for some sort of setting or some sort of like external grounding in that. And because these are just separate stories as well, maybe there is the intention of the author to try to just like highlight these individual experiences in this seamless way, as opposed to, you know, talking about the geography too. It's something to consider. That's a great point. Thank you so much.
Yeah. But I think your point is well made because it makes you jump right in
Right.
to the life of the characters.
Right. And
And it cuts across cultures. It cuts. This book can be read anywhere. I mean,
definitely. I mean, we just named that some of us don't know Portuguese, but we were able to use the context to figure out what certain derogatory terms and other terms mean. So.
You know, I was thinking about the grandmother and her friend, what they married and had children, but yet, you know, I don't know when they discovered that they were gay women, but many women had to go through that, and men too had to go through the, you know, heterosexual standards, you know, of getting married and having children, even though they were gay. And maybe they knew that they were gay from before, or maybe they discovered it later. But so that's what I was thinking about with the grandmother. She had to go through that whole heterosexual falsehood for her. And then, you know, finally she has a friend there, you know, a lover, you know. So
I think one of the weirdest things for me was being at a friend's wedding, and an older Black woman who's usually very, you know, like dressed to the nines. She comes in and her wig is askew, and she's just looking like a complete train wreck. And I'm going, something's wrong. Something's really wrong. So we pull her to the back, and we find out that she's walked in on her husband of like 40 years with another man.
Mm.
And she's completely traumatized. And there's so many of these stories of people being in relationships that are socially acceptable, but not what their real choice is.
Mm-hmm.
You know, so many different levels of masquerade and camouflage.
Yeah,
absolutely. And naming that whatever the grandma, because both folks just said something great, whatever sort of life she did choose instead of her true life, that wasn't a false cishet identity. And she was able to surround herself with like her legacy and women around her, right? And that is not necessarily false. So I love the fact that folks are like connecting and bringing up the idea that like, yeah, in order to survive, folks had to live, queer folks specifically had to live under like cishet acceptance, and still had to have the courage to love and figure out how to love and be in that. And not just courage, how do you say this in English? The Ghana. Someone help me. What does that mean? How do you say that?
Desire.
Thank you. The desire to want to put yourself in that kind of situation, you know? Very deep. Also the part when she's talking about how like the grandma didn't mourn the grandfather, that her father and her grandfather died in a car accident together, and that the men weren't mourned necessarily. I thought that was very powerful.
Yeah, I got that far, and it is striking.
Yeah,
because it's a huge silence that's intergenerational.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. And then as the grandma is about to divulge and say her truth, at that very moment is when her granddaughter can't even focus because she's thinking about the girl, Thais, I believe, that she's feeling, right? And how in her own queerness and her own understanding, her grandma's sitting trying to do that. And what ends up happening as the reader, we get put on this awesome ride of her thinking about the girl and then thinking about her grandma with her Aunt Carolina and thinking about them touching each other and then thinking about her own sexual desire to touch this girl and just going in between back and forth. It's a little bit wild because it's her grandma, but it's also like very real and very poignant and very necessary for her own, in my opinion, sexual liberation and understanding. Like she kind of has to see her grandma in that to then even see herself. I thought that was, yeah, you like that? No. You said yeah, Stephanie? Okay. Tell me what you think. You say yeah.
I think it's interesting. I think that Yeah, that scene, I love how it was written. Like, again, this, like, how she writes, it's just, it really feels like a ride. Like, it really feels like every sentence is bringing you somewhere, every word. Like, I really love that. And then, yeah, in that scene, I was just like, oh my God, how cool. Like, that is so cool. Like, I thought it was just amazing to be able to, like, imagine that and, like, have that experience with an intergenerational, like, queer within the same family experience, and, like, understanding that, like, sexuality is fluid, and, like, how it's hard to kind of, like, boggle down and kind of define, and her grandmother, like, lives it out in that way, you know, without necessarily explaining herself. She's just doing it, you know, and her character sees it. And so I just really love that part. I love how it was written, and just, like, the example of how, you know, elders and intergenerational sexuality and how fluid it is, and how powerful it would be, you know, to have those open conversations and it not be, like, you know, a secret. And I felt like the lightness in the dialogue in that section, it almost felt like the character was getting lighter and, like, more closer to her grandmother.
Period.
One of the things that came to mind when we talked about how the grandfather and the father, you know, were killed in the car accident, but they didn't seem to miss them. And when you were saying, Paula, um, about how, you know, over the centuries, gay women have had to kind of distort them, what they might want to have as a life, and get married and have a man. And it also brought to mind for me how many, and it's kind of like, again, it just resonates for me from the women in my family, how many women might entertain that life, not even women who feel like they're, or have some sense that they're queer, but just women who are, you know, living a straight life, thinking that that's what their life is, but miserable with men. Like my cousin, she says, he just gets on top of me. I'll let him do it. We've been together 30 years, you know?
I've heard that too.
Yeah. And my other cousin, you know, it's like, oh, I don't want another relationship, you know, and, you know, just the experience being so unsatisfying, but there not being a space, you know, for women who've lived their lives as straight women to even consider. And I'm not saying that now, it's a very different generation. I'm saying from my generation and before, you know, how many straight women or women who only could consider themselves as straight, you know, might have had something else in their life that was more satisfying if there hadn't been this kind of constriction about, you know, what's normal. And
That also points back to the beginning stories, where you have these characters who are having their first sexual experiences, and I think she draws well the kind of messy, sloppy, uncomfortable spaces that these young people are engaged in. Um, um,
New love often is.
right. I think she shows how imperfect it is. But to go back to your point, there is a whole, I mean, it's just something I've been observing, that these older Black women who are grandmothers, who are gay, and who weren't gay their whole lives, but somehow evolved to that. And I don't see those stories. They're living their lives, so they're not talking about it. But it's an interesting pathway to look at.
Right. And I think what Anais is naming is like, there is no path for that. And then like a lot of these people are like carving these things of their own. What would it look like if there was a space for people to kind of, because also we're naming that sexuality is fluid, right? This is a great conversation we're having now, because we're teetering in and out of the stuff, but let's get to it. If we understand sexuality to be fluid, then like, are we naming that people were straight their whole lives and now they're not? Or, you know what I mean? Like, I think it's a bit more sort of in the way we're experiencing in Amora, particularly with that grandma, or what someone else had said earlier, like, you know, but you don't know, right? And even Ron naming that, like, why are they not saying what this word means? Because there's an erasure of queer folks in families, particularly depending on cultures, right? All these things we were naming before. So to not name the thing means then that we don't have to have the conversation and explain it, because then we'd have to choose. We'd have to choose, oh, your aunt was straight for this long and now she's gay, or whatever the conversation would be, right? As opposed to the understanding that we all sort of approach this book from, which is that like, oh, well, this is a fluid, sexuality is fluid, right? And maybe these women weren't always all the way straight or all the way queer, whatever that looks like. Or there is no such thing as all the way queer. Sexuality is fluid, again, right? So I love the fact that we're in these conversations because we kind of get to dismantle our own language, which is really important.
Do you think we'll ever move away from the language, though, as far as labeling what people's sexual orientation is? Like, what do you think will, and this is kind of off topic, but on topic, do you think we'll just get to a point where there won't be the use of the term straight or gay? It'll just be somebody in love with someone else. Yeah. And if they're in love with Joe this week and then Mary in 2 years, will it matter so much?
That's a great question.
I don't know if that's a goal or if that's inevitable. Like, you know, do people even want that? Do people want a world where there are no labels? And if we do we start with sexuality because there's so many labels throughout, you know, the world that we kind of navigate?
Right. I don't know the answer to that, but I do know that if we're going to dismantle any kind of labels, we got to start with cis heterosexuality. Like, we're those who walk in this identity of like cis hetness, that's the identity that kind of needs to be dismantled first. And then because we're the ones that label people, right? In a cis het society, we're the one creating labels to either oppress or uplift or whatever the goal is. So however that looks in the future, that's a great question to pose. And it won't start with queer identity. I think it starts in like cis het identity, you know, dismantling that, because the youth, as those of us who are so young in here know, but I'm talking about babies, children, teenagers, right? They are committed to language in a particular way, not to labels, but they're committed to naming what they think they're experiencing, what they know they're experiencing, what they're experiencing from others. And I know this because I work with youth, right? And they drive me crazy. And some of you have youth and you're raising them and you know what that is in that proximity, right? Like, they are committed to having that work and having that language. And then the last thing I would say, and I love to hear what y'all would say, is that I think it's like, I can't think of the analogy, but it's the idea that work with me here, okay? Because I can't think of what the analogy is, but it's this idea that like, we're going to keep going to this resource center to get the same resource, to get the same resource, to get the same resource. But eventually the goal is to burn the resource center down, because we won't need those resources in that way, because people will be well equipped to do what they got to do. And I think when it comes to like language in particular, labels, particularly in queer identity, it's like, let the youth and future generations determine all the language necessary so that one day cis hetero patriarchy or cis hetero normalcy, whatever it is itself, cis hetero-ness itself, just kind of, right, deflates and burns, and people get to walk in what they need. I know that's an aggressive analogy. You can come for me later. I'm not trying to say burn it up, but maybe, right? I don't know. But what do y'all think?
I mean, I think it has to happen simultaneously in all these different communities. I don't see that it has to happen in one community. I think it's I think it needs to be in more than one place. And I think for the OGs in the house, all of this stuff is it's just not new. I mean, there were different language in the 80s, different language in the 90s for all of this sexuality. It's been here before. It's just been called something different. And how people own or disown it may have evolved. I don't know. I don't have any answers, but I don't think it can happen in just one community. I don't think you can dismantle cis het, as you call it, and expect some huge ass miracle. I just don't see that happening. I think it has to be in all of these various communities. And I think
I didn't say anything about a huge ass miracle at all. I just want to name that because that's important to me to name the tension in that wording, right? Like I'm naming that cis het people, we as cis het people, those who identify as cis het people with me here in this space, we're the ones that get to choose and live in that. And it's other people that have to live in the labels, you know? It's not a big ass miracle at all by any means, but it's an understanding that not everybody got to do the work all the time. Some people got to do more work than others, you know? And thank you for naming that, because that's naming that this is not the first generation to be in that. We've been in this for a minute. So thank you.
Yeah, no, I've been looking at this for a long, long time. And, you know, but I'll leave it alone. I'm going to leave it alone.
But I think that also, I mean, it would be great if we were just seen as living beings, really, everybody, regardless of gender or race. But I mean, if you're going to do the gender, you got to do the race, you got to do the ethnic groups, you got to do the nationalities, really. I mean, it can't be unlabeling one group and not unlabeling other groups too, So it would be, I'll never see it, but maybe my future children, grandchildren, maybe they will see that just being a human being, or not even just a human being, a living being matters.
Right. A living being with stories that are reflected of you, things that you see. Because again, I got to say it, like we as cis het people get that all the time. Queer people don't necessarily have that. They don't necessarily get to open a book and see what it looks like to fall in love. They don't get to turn on the show. Now they do, sure. But we're naming that not everyone has that starting field. So everyone has work in order to dismantle, right? Queer people themselves. When you look at queer culture, we could talk all the time about how trans people are treated by queer people. Like it always goes on. And as the predominant culture in cis hetero patriarchy, which is what we are in this country, we got to name that there is more work. You can't just say, oh, everyone's going to do the same, because that's just not true. And I think a lot of homophobic people then they go, oh, well, I don't want to do more work than someone, like not us here clearly, but when you meet someone who's homophobic, it's hard for them to kind of get to that, right? Because it's a lot of work to be in that understanding. And I think that we in this country are rooted in that. And it's like, I don't want to do all that work, but we may have to. I want to name, this is a human book, but this is a queer book. A queer experience, queer love, queer women, right? And that's a different.
It's queer, but it's also human.
Sure, definitely.
Because I mean, those experiences that those sisters went through, as a cis woman, I went through too. So.
Right, but they're getting outed in this book, right? There are things that we're not
saying. But I'm just saying that we have to look at just, the humanity of it all, too. I understand what you're saying, but
right, because oftentimes when we name queerness, then people are like, oh, but we're all human. But I am saying we're human. I'm saying they're queer. There's like, you know what I mean? I just want to be clear with everyone that it's like, not that it's not human, it's very human. It's a queer human experience. And
right, but people don't think that many people don't think queers are reflective of them, if they're cis. They just think of it as, oh, those queer people, they go through this, but I don't go through that. And it's not true, so. And then, we have to remember that we're in New York City. There are a lot of people in the Midwest or upstate New York who don't, who.
Around the corner.
Around the
Right.
corner in New York City.
Around the
The
corner,
corner
right.
boys don't believe it either. They don't believe it either.
Right.
Or in your church choir.
Right. The local bodega owner.
Yes.
Yeah.
I just learned a name too that if I could just interject for 1 second. So queer, like the word, is actually a political term. So there may be folks who are asexual, identify as a lesbian. Specifically, they're using lesbian in this particular book, like they're using that word lesbian. Queer doesn't necessarily translate. It's queer in whatever language. So it's interesting because when we use queer in the US context, it was a reclaimed word and it's a political context. So when people identify as queer, it's very political to say that. So now everybody uses queer because not everybody's political about it. There's folks who live their life and want to get married just like straight people, you know what I mean? And they won't say queer. They'll say gay, they'll say bisexual, lesbian, you know what I mean? So I identify as queer very much as a political thing, as well as, just who I am. But when I go to Ecuador to visit, fam over there, and I say identify as queer, they say, oh, that's an imperialist term. We don't use that term here. You know what I mean? So it's interesting again. And I want to just, language is a living thing, right? We're constantly making up words. I constantly make up words all the time, playing around, and I think that the word queer has definitely evolved, is reclaimed as a political term, and it doesn't necessarily carry everywhere. And we're talking about a story based in Brazil. And even when I went to Brazil several times for feminist conferences and all these things, it's still a contention, where lesbians are particularly clear about being lesbians. And there's and see queerness or bisexuality as messy. Like, it's not necessarily there's tensions there too with the language and how, all of that gets experienced and stuff like that. So I just wanted to share that, my personal experience, and going to South America, both Ecuador and Brazil, and saying I'm queer and being like, oh, what's this gringa doing here talking about queerness? You know what I mean? And seeing that come up in my own experience, and then still being rooted yeah, I'm part of the diaspora, I'm part of the people that dropped off in the belly of the beast over here, but this is the language we're using. How about y'all? You know what I mean? And it's interesting to see though. And I think Ron poses an interesting question as we think about language as a living thing and how it reflects the generations, and definitely always look to young people for that, period.
Period. No, stop. Thank you, Stephanie, for sharing that and naming that, and everyone else that named stuff. It doesn't all fit, right? It doesn't all fit into the pieces, particularly the way that we've created it here. I just know that what comes up for me most as a 31-year-old person, I know some of you are like, you're only 31, shut your trap. But I'm really 131. Remember I told you last time I'm older than I look. But as a 31 person who's committed to my community and the people who I love, I read this book and I think about how so often, for real, the experience of people in my community, particularly who don't identify as straight, right, are people who then have to tell their stories again in order to make it relatable for all of us. That's what comes up for me as I'm going through the book, and thinking about all the ways, all the time, constantly, that the people in my community have to show up twice, and what does the labor look like to kind of just not have that happen and change my own lens. It's not like I picked up this book and was like, ooh, I am a cis het straight woman. That's the lens in which I'm reading that, and I have to do whatever difficulty or whatever joy I find in opening my lens so that I can receive the character, not so that the writer themselves has to write it in a way so that I can receive that character. That's what I'm sharing with y'all for me, personally.
I think the book is refreshing. I remember the literature and stuff that was written in the 80s and 90s, and most of it had a huge amount of violence. And you know, and a lot of the stories occurred in deep and shadowy margins. A lot of it, but it was very, very violent. So that she centers these stories in regular places, schools, you know, the kitchen, you know, one's home. I think is an evolution of that literature, at least from what I'm talking about the stuff that I saw here in the States. I can't speak to what Brazilian queer literature might have looked like 20, 30 years ago. But just in terms, in a general sense, they're definitely refreshing. Not that there won't be violence in them, but in that early literature, a lot of it was so violent, you know. And I listened to a lot of that literature.
I agree.
So I think it's refreshing.
Yeah, I agree. To your point and to Miss Johnson's point, it's like reading a coming of age story sometimes, right? Almost for certain. Yes. Yeah, it's like, oh, definitely.
And so I mean, I would, you know, so she might even be, you know, saying that these stories are more in the center than they ever were before.
Yes, that's on period poo, Miss Johnson. Actually, I'm gonna clap for that. That is really what I feel is the push for this. And I watched Natalia give a couple of interviews, and I think she names almost to that wording that you just said. So beautiful, beautiful observations. For real. On period poo, Ms. Johnson, that's a famous philosopher that's very popular nowadays on Instagram and the music. And the thing is right, she goes on period poo, and everyone says it. So that's why I said that to you.
All right.
Okay.
Hey, I'm on point.
Exactly. He's 100% right.
Ms. Johnson walking around like on period.
Period poo. Yeah.
I'm gonna get my T-shirt.
Okay. All right, folks. What about, let's move toward we only have half hour left or so. Let's get into the last two stories. I actually didn't read Boots, so if somebody want to tell me what happens, let me know. What happens in Boots? Who read Boots? Everybody read Boots? Yes. Would you like to tell us, Sharon?
I kind of, from reading it, I was looking for the middle part. It was like, okay, she committed suicide. Did she get raped by some men? And I like the part where she said that she really loved her friend Linda, I think it is. I thought that was good. But you know, when in reading throughout all these stories, it's like, wow, things has really changed, and how bad it was, you know, in the past, in terms of this person being a lesbian, how they were treated, what they had to hide, because there was so many secrets throughout all of these stories. And I wondered why Kay committed suicide. I wanted to read the rest of it. So that's my fault.
Thank you. Anyone else? Can anyone answer those questions, or what do y'all think? Maybe you didn't read it. That's cool. You know, I'm not tripping.
I didn't read it.
I didn't read it.
Me either.
Thank you. Sharon was like, look, I didn't read it. I'm glad the other Sharon read it. I didn't read it.
I think that might be for next week. Boots.
Oops. Yeah, we may have to, because no
Actually,
one.
No, I'm saying, was that included in the pages for
Oh,
next week?
it was.
Yes.
Okay. So
It was.
I didn't
According
read.
to this book,
Obviously, I didn't read. So
next week is my cousin is in town.
Right.
Okay. Thank you.
I think Kay, to answer Sharon's question, I think Kay was a very sad and depressed girl or woman, or I'm not exactly sure how old she was, but she felt disfigured. She felt alone, isolated, very sad, depressed, and something happened. She killed someone. She killed a college roommate or a college friend. So I think that all of that came into play as to the guilt that she felt in her heart. So, and also, you know, Fran, who's her girlfriend, she felt all of that. And despite anything, she kind of disfigured herself when she shaved her hair. I think that was kind of somewhat symbolic as well. So she shaves her hair and then she kills herself with crushed pills and a bottle of vodka. So I think all of this just kind of made her feel guilty, and she couldn't go on any longer, no matter how, you know, how much therapy or whatever help she was getting, it wasn't helping her.
But they said that part was a rumor. They said it was the whole, she killed the person, and they really didn't tell. Why was she with these three people? I mean, was it self-defense? So that was the part that I was like, you know.
Yeah. You know, I think you're right. But I also think that even if, well, let's try and take away the rumor part, but let's just say, what if she did it in self-defense? You're right. Like, what if she did do it? There's still a bit of remorse and guilt there, right? So she probably felt, wow, I'm feeling horrible about myself, no matter if I did this in self-defense. And she couldn't take it anymore. And also probably her relationship with Fran probably wasn't a really good one as well. So maybe she was just kind of lashing out towards herself.
You said her relationship with Fran wasn't good? It wasn't a good one?
Yeah, I don't think so. I mean, it doesn't seem to be good. It didn't seem to be very good.
What I did do was read the last sentence, and I saw that Fran was mad sad because she missed her. So I was like, oh, maybe they're good friends. But it's good to know that they weren't. Anyone else?
I think she just kept everything inside, and like her demons destroyed her because she wasn't able to share, you know, whatever she wanted to share, that she, you know. So I think that was it, really.
So on page 50, it says, well, yeah, page 50, it goes, it was nothing, they said, nothing, chin up. But it was a disjoining, a sense of unbelonging, of having been torn from the world, being far from what we understood, what we understand love to be. It wasn't pretty. No, feeling that way was cold, ugly, painful, and lonely. No one could take her away from that place, not even Fran. So I guess in that beginning part, they're like setting it up that Kay just wasn't well. And I think Kay names that she's not well in the short story as well. And then not even Fran. She opened a bottle of vodka and had one glass and another and another. Only then did she reach for the pills, etc. So I feel like she had like really deep depression. And then, you know, Fran and trying to make sense of things. It's like, maybe it was that time. I heard stories of Kay killing a classmate in college on page 53. She'd been trying to defend herself against a group of three. Kay had never told her about it, though. She'd never mentioned the subject because Kay didn't talk about it. Fran never knew whether it had happened, but she knew it had been awful. And then the family had left the state. Kay dropped out of college. So whether or not it happened, something happened that she had to drop out. But yeah, keeping things in. There's a lot of self-loathing, like very, very deep self-loathing. And then the part that I found interesting was that Fran went to put on Kay's boots, and that's why it's called boots. She wanted to feel like, what was it that happened? She wanted, almost like a forensic investigator, like went in and put on her boots and try to feel or imagine what it was. And I thought that was really sad. I thought that was so, so sad. Yeah.
Did you cry? No, I'm playing.
I didn't cry, surprisingly. I was trying to figure out, like, are they together? And I guess, yeah, they had to have been together, but you know, it could have easily also been a very best friend. And then also, like, I think maybe not naming that was her girlfriend, because they didn't say that. I think there's an intimacy and a romance between friends, you know, and like between women who take care of each other, besties, whatever you want to call it. But yeah, I think it could have been her partner too. Yeah.
Cool. Now I feel bad for not reading the last story. I'm like, oh my gosh, it ended. It sounds like a
time.
It was OD. It was OD. Yeah. I was like, oh my gosh, suicide. Here we go.
Yeah, it sounds OD. I'm not that I'm excited to read it, but I am excited to finish that part.
It's just so well written. It's just good to read it, you know.
Yeah.
But somebody mentioned how everything like that has to do with like, you know, queerness or LGBTQ folks, there's always some sort of trauma story attached to it. And I think we also talked about this in the last book about having like trauma stories attached to like marginal identities. I think this was it. I don't know, we haven't done the rest of the book, but maybe the suicide, because there's always something about suicide when it comes to queerness or like gayness or anything like that.
Yeah, I was just reading that that Brazil is ranked as one of the most deadliest countries for LGBTQI identities.
Absolutely.
So kind of having that context, you know, and, you know, kind of understanding Boots and reading Boots, putting it in that context, you know, makes this like a very plausible reality that this, that suicide is very much a part of, you know, of this experience, just because of the cultural and national context in which it's in. So
definitely. Thank you for sharing that. I'll echo the sentiment that I too enjoy thus far the sweetness that we've been like finding in some of these characters, the vulnerability that doesn't necessarily come at the strenuous cost of like death. I guess, well, I speak too soon because apparently in Boots, this is what happens. But I do think that Natalia gives us more of these moments. And it's what folks were naming earlier, like, regardless of my identity, I can relate to that, right? Like someone had said, I think it was Miss Jacqueline Johnson or Kagiso, I'm not sure who said it, Johnson, but one of them had named like, yeah, as a straight woman, I've had that experience, and seeing that like other folks and other identities get to experience sweetness and tenderness. I think that's very beautiful and important. I like that a lot. I want to take this time to name for y'all that Ron has so graciously posted the titles of the next chapters. So let's say you're not going by number in the book or you're listening audio. So I'm going to just read them aloud. You feel free to write them down, screenshot, whatever. But for next week, the chapters, the titles are My Cousin is in Town. Very relatable. No. Dreaming. Renfield's Demons. Hermetic Dramaturge. Como te extraño, Carla. Oh no, Clara, sorry. Como te extraño, Clara. Meaning, how I miss you, Clara. You're laughing at that. So hopefully you're able to read all of those next week. With the last 10 minutes, now that we've sort of gotten a little bit into, we've gotten just our toe in the water of where the author is trying to take us in terms of love stories. I have a couple of questions, but I guess the first one I have for y'all is, do you see this continuing in more broken stories? Do you see the stories getting longer? Do you think something's going to change in the way she's telling us these stories in the beginning? Hint, maybe, right? But, or maybe you're like, as I'm reading, I don't have any air of that. Sharon.
I'm sorry. I wonder if she will avoid the sort of the violence angle where I think Anais, I'm not sure if it was Anais who was speaking to it earlier, that all these stories or queer stories, actually it was Jacqueline Johnson, that queer stories or particularly lesbian stories, often there is some kind of violent act because the women are expressing their love, and that love is met within society by violence in books and literature. And I'm hoping it doesn't take that turn. And I hope that the author continues to frame queerness within normal humanity. And violence is part of normal humanity, sadly, but not as a plot device.
Right.
You know, just there might be some queer people beating up some straight people. That would be nice, like a little different. But, you know, just try to keep it out of what you sort of expect when you read these stories, you know.
Definitely. And to that point, Ron, I do know in doing research for the book that there are poems coming too. Like some of the stories are tied. You know, I love a poem, folks. I'm a poet for those of us that are new to me and who I am. And I'm really excited to see how they tell the story and they meld a short story with a poem. That's going to be fun.